This is what the implosion of the Titan would look like. Implosion is a process in which objects are destroyed by being squeezed on themselves. Usually involves a difference between internal and external pressure. This action is very fast, less than a second.
So the question has come up since the Titan submersible disaster. Given that the submersible imploded, that this was a sudden, catastrophic implosion as they characterize it, would the passengers have been able to even perceive what was happening, or would it have been too fast for them to really even know what was going on? So there's two parts to that question. One is, how fast would the submersible have collapsed? How long would that process have taken? And the second is, how long does it take for your brain to process information? So I'm a neurologist, so I could speak a little bit more towards the second part of that question than the first. But by all accounts that I could find online, as this video showed, so clearly the implosion would have been very, very fast. Some people say instantaneous, but that's a kind of a vague term. It would have occurred in, from what I could find, less than a millisecond is probably a reasonable average estimate of how long it would have taken. But even if it took 100 times longer than that, 100 milliseconds or a tenth of a second, that still is not enough time for your brain to register what's happening. So we know how long things take, neurologically to happen, because nerves conduct their signals at a certain rate, depending on the nerve, depending on whether the nerve is myelinated or unmyelinated, and how myelinated it is, and how long you have to conduct. So typically, if we are, for example, I do nerve conduction studies where I measure the velocity of peripheral nerves. They could be anywhere from 40 to 60 meters per second. For heavily myelinated nerves, it could be 70 to 100, meters per second. So what does that mean? In terms of the brain itself, like just to communicate with itself, right? For the brain to form a thought, right? Any kind of processing of information, it's at least 100 to 150 milliseconds, right? 150 milliseconds is probably a good sort of average number to put into your head. In order for the brain to receive external information and process it, we're talking more like 300 milliseconds. So if we're saying, even if we use sort of the low end of that estimate of 100 milliseconds, that's still 100 times longer than 1 millisecond. And, even the high end of estimates of how long it would have taken for the submersible to implode, the implosion would have happened at, probably two or more, at least one order of magnitude faster than your nervous system would be able to receive and process the information. So what does that mean? That means what the passengers would have experienced would have been nothing. It would have been just an instantaneous blackout. There would have been no point at which they would have perceived that anything was happening. It's like getting a bullet to the back of the brain, which now, whenever I think about that, I always think of the last episode of The Sopranos, that famous, mysterious episode where everyone thought that their TV, was unplugged or whatever, the power went out. Because it was just blackout. Like there was no perception of anything. You don't hear the bullet. You don't hear anything happening. You don't feel anything. It's just your stream of consciousness comes to an abrupt end. That's what happens when you take a bullet to the brain. You can't process it fast enough for you to actually experience anything. So the collapse of the submersible was very likely a bullet to the back of the head to the passengers. They had no perception of what was happening, just instant lights out. So that's at least some comfort, in my opinion. When I was, following this story in real time, the notion that they were trapped in a sealed submersible, it was bolted from the outside. They had no way, even if they were at the surface, they couldn't get out of it. That they were trapped in an unsurvivable environment under tremendous pressure. for days, slowly starving and lacking water and losing oxygen, et cetera. That would have been a horrific experience. Given that they didn't survive, given that premise, the instantaneous, I think, end is probably better. So, some people do take solace in that. It is interesting to think, like, all right, would they have known there was anything wrong with the submersible? Like, was it before it collapsed? Would they have known it was about to collapse? And again, from what I've been able to research, what I've been able to find online, I think the answer to that is no. Even the smallest crack in that chamber, right, in the pressurized chamber that the passengers were in, even the smallest crack would have led to that instantaneous catastrophic collapse, implosion, that we saw animated there. So no, it's not like the water would have been leaking for a while. No, that doesn't happen. It's just complete. It's like popping a balloon, but in reverse, right? The air doesn't slowly leak out. It just pops. Same thing. And that, when you think about popping a balloon, what's the difference in pressure from inside the balloon to outside the balloon? It's nothing compared to the pressures they were dealing with. Again, from what I've read, the at that depth that they likely were at, they were at 37 atmospheres. That's 37 times the pressure on the outside versus the inside of the vessel. If you do the calculations in terms of pounds per square inch, that's a tremendous amount of force, just an unbelievable amount of force. Again, once that gave away, the collapse would have been that sub-millisecond kind of collapse, no time to perceive anything. So interesting sort of neurological angle to that tragic story that I thought I would add, to the evolving story, what happened. Again, it is something I think you could take a little bit of solace in it. There was no time for them to suffer or even realize what was happening.